this was an unprecedented shock. When it started at the end of January, early February, we didn't realize that. And the analysis that we did was to look back at the experience of previous pandemics, and almost all of them in the past, in fact all of them, had followed this V-shaped, or had the impact on air travel of a V-shape, whereby 3 months after the outbreak we had the worst point, and then 3 to 4 months after that travel was back to normal. The historic experience of air travel has been very robust to these sorts of shocks, and at the time we thought this was going to be largely a regional demand shock. Of course, we're now today in a very different situation, and in many ways this has progressed from what was just a regional demand shock to a global supply shock, because essentially because of the way governments have reacted to the spread of the virus by travel restrictions and, of course, locking down the economies, enforcing distancing between people, essentially shutting down much of not just the air transport industry but also the global economy. And I think that means that when we're thinking about the recovery, the restart, it's not just going to be a matter of stimulating air travel demand again. We've also got to think about how do we get grounded airlines and the air transport system back off the ground again. There are lots of issues around that which we've not had to deal with in the past. So 3 weeks ago, we published this impact assessment on air travel measured by RPKs, and also airline passenger revenue compared to 2019 levels. These impact assessments are rather like hitting moving targets. At the time, 3 weeks ago, we estimated that we'd see a loss of almost 40% in RPKs. We have never seen that degree of shock in the airline industry at a cost just for passenger revenues of about $250 billion. When we did that in March, at the end of March, the number of flights globally was down about 65%. We also took into account the forecasts of economic recession, because clearly that was going to affect the speed at which passengers would return to travel in perhaps the third quarter and the fourth quarter. And we also made the assumption about a progressive relaxation of travel restrictions. This is the situation in terms of the year-on-year changes in flights, in the number of air traffic movements, as it stood a few days ago. And you can see that from the blue line in the middle, that what was once, well, when we did the impact assessment, flights were down 65%, they're now down about 80%. And really, outside of the domestic markets in North America and in Asia Pacific, China, you can see that essentially international aviation has come to a halt. We have got some cargo flights. The cargo business is still running at the moment, and some repatriation flights. But we are now really in a situation where passenger markets internationally have evaporated, and the industry is grounded, which is really unprecedented. I think the second issue is that a few weeks ago, economists were forecasting what at the time was quite a severe recession. The forecasts for global GDP growth today are that in the second quarter of this year we should expect to see global GDP down perhaps 6% year on year. That has never happened before. The global financial crisis is rather paling into insignificance in in this supply shock, because obviously, people have, I think one point to make is that the global economy, more or less was in quite good shape before this hit. So whereas in the global financial crisis, there was a clear disequilibrium, and indeed that took, after the global financial crisis, that has taken, some years to recover from. I think the expectation amongst macroeconomists is that if the health issue is resolved, then the global economy should respond to the massive fiscal and monetary stimuluses and rebound substantially in 2021. But I think the assumption on the resolving of the health issue is a big one. And we just don't really know how that's going to be resolved at the moment. Clearly, macroeconomically, there aren't the big imbalances that would mean that this sort of shock would be very long lasting. But there's an important question about how quickly and how broadly travel restrictions and indeed, restrictions on the lockdown will be lifted. And that's quite important for travel, I think, because the experience that we've seen in China is that containment has worked fairly well there. They are getting some new cases. Most of those are imported cases from people returning to the country. And they have opened, China is going back to work, perhaps not back to play, but back to work. And we've seen an opening of the domestic air travel market. And, we haven't seen a return to pre-crisis levels by any means, but flights are increasing. Load factors have risen to around about 60%. So I think it's a reasonable assumption that governments will be, once containment is reached, which we hope will happen, domestic markets will open, but I think it's likely that we'll see a much slower opening of international markets. We've seen China starting to relax and then tighten international restrictions because of the import of COVID-19 cases, and the same is true in Singapore and some other Asian economies. So I think when we're thinking about the move out of lockdown and travel restrictions in the second half of this year, we hope, it's likely that we'll see a phased approach to opening. There are obviously a lot of people who travel within domestic markets. It's the majority in terms of the number of passengers. In terms of RPKs, perhaps a more important metric for the revenues, they're less important, and the fact that international markets may open more slowly is perhaps more important. Then let me turn very quickly to an assessment of what the next 3 months might be like for airline finances, because the profile that we presented, which had an annual average decline of 38% in RPKs in 2020, 3 weeks ago, included a 70+% decline in the second quarter, which is obviously a huge revenue shock. So what can airlines do in response to that? And indeed, this probably, this sort of analysis is true all the way down the supply chain of air transport. I'm focusing on airlines, but clearly, it's the whole of the air transport supply chain that we need to think about in order to, bring air transport services back to life. But what can airlines do? Well, if they're grounding much of their capacity, then variable costs are down very substantially, and lower fuel prices are obviously helping that as well. The challenge for airlines, and this goes for others in the supply chain as well, is that many costs are fixed, at least, or semi-fixed over a short period of time. Now, over a longer period of time, obviously, there are not that many costs that are fixed, but certainly if we're talking about, the next quarter or the next 6 months, there's not much airlines can do about some of the expenses here on the right-hand side. There are commitments, there are some rigidities here. So essentially, the point is that there are some costs that can't be avoided by airlines, despite the fact their revenues have disappeared. And what we've done in this waterfall chart is we've looked at the second quarter. So we've looked at revenues, we've looked at the reduction in variable costs, crew costs, semi-fixed costs, fixed costs that probably can't change. And as you can see from that chart, if you accumulate those costs, it goes about, $25–30 billion below revenues. So, what we're saying is that there's a net loss of about, $38–40 billion expected in the second quarter. Now, the issue for airlines at the moment is it's not just that they can't avoid some costs. It's also that they're due to refund about $35 billion of tickets that were sold but unused. And in sort of cash flow accounts, this turns up in the working capital, a rise in liabilities, and that's a negative. That's a cash outflow. They're burning cash. So, in total, it looks like the industry might burn about $61 billion of cash in the second quarter. I mean, that is an enormous outflow of liquid assets, of cash resources from airlines, and that's really sort of driven what I'm sure you'll have seen in terms of the requests for government intervention. In an industry which is largely private, these are sort of extraordinary times, and while there are some airlines that have got the resources and the ability to borrow from the banks and capital markets, that's actually not the case for most. I'm not going to talk through this chart, but this provides some detail of our estimates for that cash burn. Let me just go on to really look at the overall situation of the airline industry. And this chart ranks airlines by their economic profits. And the three lines show different years, and it shows that between 2008 and 2017 and 2018, so the 10 years where at an industry level we saw a pretty large improvement in industry financial performance, in industry profitability for the airline sector. You can see from this chart that improvement was really driven by about 20 or 30 airlines. It was actually quite a narrowly based improvement, and the vast majority of the airlines, a long tail of airlines, as you can see, really just breaking even, and indeed we've still got a number of large loss makers in the industry. So the point, I think, of this is that while there are 20 or 30 airlines in a strong position, the industry as a whole is really very fragile. And this is shown particularly if we look at their balance sheets, because that top 20 or 30 airlines managed to reduce debt substantially. It's got very robust balance sheets. It can weather storms with levels of debt to income of these sorts of levels. But if you look at the red line, the rest of the industry saw no improvement at all. And has still got high levels of debt. So, the majority of airlines in the industry are in a parlous position. And then, sort of my final slide is really just showing the cash position. If you look at the cash and those assets that are sort of near cash equivalents, and express those as a sort of ratio of 2019 revenues, that gives you an idea of how many months airlines can last on the cash they've got in the bank. And you can see there are wide ranges. There are some airlines, probably those top 20 or 30 who have got lots of cash. The median airline, the typical airline has got about 2 months worth of cash. And so given that sort of revenue shock, I think the situation in the airline industry is that many airlines, if not already, are very close to running out of cash. So, just to conclude, I just sort of want to draw your attention to just a few points that I think come out of that analysis. One is that we're not likely to see all markets open up at the same time, which will obviously affect developments in the recovery phase. Given the financial situation, inevitably we're going to have much more government participation in the airline industry in equity stakes or other relationships, but not all are going to be saved. I think we're going to see lots of airline failures and therefore some consolidation of the industry. But it's also not just about the airlines. I think we need to look at this as through the supply chain to make sure that when recovery comes, the whole air transport industry is able to support travel and trade and investment again. There are going to be lots of aircraft and gates and staff around, which probably means actually lower barriers to entry. So it could be quite an interesting market. Is business travel going to suffer from everyone's use of Zoom and other video conferencing technologies? Are products going to change? I know Delta at the moment is keeping the middle seat empty. Certainly, it might be that we certainly don't see the ancillaries and fees that we've had in the past, and certainly I think we're going to see some balance sheet changes with pressure for more cash and perhaps less capital spending from the airlines. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Brian. Wow, this is really a frightening picture, I would say, that you're painting. And the plan is we are having a break at 10:50. And before that, we have one panel session. And afterwards, we have another panel session. And the idea in the first panel session to address and discuss the short-term effects and how to deal with the current situation. And in the second panel session, we will talk more about the long-term effects. How does it affect the aviation industry in the longer term? Now, what the Hong Kong government did is decided to do is to in order to help the Hong Kong-based airlines, is to buy 500,000 tickets. Now, do you think this is appropriate thing to do, or do you have some other ideas? I think we start the panel discussion maybe with Mike. Mike? Yeah, Mike Tretheway.
Good morning, good evening. It's 1:30 a.m. where I am. This is the first I'd heard about the Hong Kong proposal to buy tickets by the government. Is it simply buying tickets and not using them? Or are they going to give the tickets away? Or is this for government travel that's needed or not? I'm just not sure what the situation is.
Yeah, I do believe that it is. No, they will use it later on. Yeah, but I'm also, I just heard that number in the news, and I thought it was sort of like a pragmatic and quick approach to sort of help the airlines.
Well, if these are purchasing tickets in advance, so we're going to pre-purchase tickets for a year, for example, that'll help offset that negative black bar that Brian had in his presentation about ticket refunds. So this is going to be a cash flow game for airlines. So injecting money into the sector is interesting. Mm-hmm. Happy to talk about airports if you want.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so I was asked to very briefly provide a few comments about airports. So Brian gave a perspective on the airlines. Um, there's a whole supply chain that's affected by this, starting up the supply chain with the manufacturers and down the supply chain to tourism. And I think we're going to touch on many of them. Airports are profoundly affected just as the airlines are, but it's a bit different. Airlines have a different risk profile than airlines. We've seen for decades now that airlines go bankrupt, but the aircraft tend to stay in the system, and somebody will end up coming and serving the market. Budapest is a really good example of, an experience, but they're not the only ones. We've seen in the United States airports that were dehubbed by airlines, and eventually some other airline comes in, perhaps with a different type of operation or a different scale. But somebody does, and so this means that airports actually have a lower risk profile from the point of view of the financial community. Typical airport investors are actually pension funds and insurance funds, and they're in this to match their long-term liabilities with long-term value assets. So I suspect that airports are probably going to have a greater ability to finance themselves through this terrible experience that we're having. Now, it's not going to be uniform. Airports that are large hubs, fortress hubs, and even medium hubs should have a challenge, but a way through to get financing through debt. Some of them may actually end up with additional equity financing, although there may be some dilution of the existing shareholders, but maybe just modest. The small non-hub airports, however, are going to be challenged. I'm based here in Canada, and we actually have airports now that have no traffic at all. And so their revenues have almost completely disappeared. The small airports typically have very limited non-aeronautical sources of revenues. But there's some major changes coming for airports. We are expecting that there's going to be, just like after the 9/11 response, of major changes in the security and screening of passengers for security purposes. We're now expecting that's going to take place in the health dimension. And so we're looking that governments are likely going to implement both departure and arrival screening of passengers for health purposes. We don't know exactly what this is going to look like and what type of technologies are going to be deployed, but we know it's going to be expensive. It's going to involve investment in capital. It's going to involve investment in operating resources, staffing, and it's likely going to require space, just as the introduction of deeper security required airports to set aside or build additional space. We're expecting that's going to come. And here's the real bad news. We're expecting that this is going to be accompanied by new fees. Two final comments about airports. One is that we are expecting a shift in airports to be somewhat greater orientation to cargo. This is something that has already been in the process as we've seen the shift to an e-commerce rather than bricks and mortar shopping culture. But the COVID experience is accelerating people's use of this. We are seeing greater interest in distribution centers locating at airports. A number of reasons for that, but one is also that with an airport, you have a point of entry screening, whether it's for health, security, or other purposes. A second comment that ties into Brian's presentation, where he was pointing out that for the airlines, RPKs, the distance component, the kilometers component, matters quite a bit. And so international travel is a small part of the number of passengers, well, a modest part of the number of passengers, less than half, but more than half in terms of the RPKs and the revenues. For airports, that's not the case. Distance doesn't matter. it's about passengers. And so as the recovery originates in the domestic sector originally, that's probably going to leave airports a little bit better off in that their passenger-driven fees and revenues will be going up. The non-aeronautical revenues going up, although less. An international passenger typically spends more money. But we also have a suspicion, and that's all it is at this point, that we're probably going to see a greater use of personal vehicles in some economies, and so a faster recovery in parking revenues than people accessing the airport for transit. So I'll pause at this point and can move on to another topic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. This was actually very insightful. Ian, you as a government, as a regulator, so to say, how do you think governments can respond in the short term to this situation?
Yeah, okay. I guess the first thing I have to say is, while I have a regulatory role, what I'm going to express is my opinion and not Australian government policy. I don't want to get myself in serious problems with the minister for making things up on the run. But having put that caveat, a lot of the discussion at the beginning was around slots, very short-term focus. What happens if I can't keep my slots because I don't operate a few flights? But I think we're now at much wider issues. And a good example in the Australian environment is the government negotiated with the Japanese additional access to Tokyo Haneda Airport. And one of the requirements of that was that those traffic rights be used by the 31st of which is already 10 days ago, 12 days ago. So we're in a situation now where there are, in not just Australia, and the Malaysian regulator is even stricter than us, use it or lose it with traffic rights that are allocated. So we're now in a situation where the Australian government has closed the borders effectively. We are told we cannot travel, and that may run, by some comments, until the end of this year. The New Zealanders have sealed the borders and are actively pursuing complete eradication of the virus, but that means keeping borders sealed for an extended period of time. People are talking perhaps until a vaccine turns up. So the border closures, and I think Brian really amply has covered it in looking at the balance between domestic and international. But I think the international return is going to be not just slow, but also patchy. Which countries decide they'll allow in, perhaps if Australia and New Zealand have eradicated the virus, we allow travel between these two countries, but the border stays up with everybody else. And I think it will take quite some time, and it'll be quite an erratic and unstable return to whatever becomes the new normal for international travel. The other regulatory questions that come up then, as airlines are struggling for cash in the short term, is this question around ownership and control. Do we stay wedded to the 1944 version of the Chicago Convention and insist on 51% ownership, or is this a time when we could see mergers across borders? Sadly, I think what's more likely to happen is that the governments will run in and prop up the regular candidates that turn up every time, that are still state-owned and are often some of the consistent loss makers that were on Brian's chart before, and that we wind back, unfortunately, a lot of the progress we made on privatizing this industry and on making it more commercially focused and more competitive. I'd be very sad to see that be the case, but I rather suspect we might be going in that direction. I think probably that's enough for me on the regulatory perspective, but looking forward to joining in the conversation later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian. So Andrew, you also, I think you are kind of thinking about, how to improve international policy coordination. Is there something that you would want to add to what Ian just said?
Thanks, Achim. Absolutely. A lot of what I want to say, I suspect we'll talk about after the break, but let me just pick up on a couple of points. The first one that Brian made, Brian said this is unprecedented to see air transport move to such a low number. Of course, it isn't unprecedented. This is what happened during World War II. The commercial aviation industry effectively fell off the cliff. And what happened after that was the governments got together and created a new regulatory framework. If ever there was a moment where we could do that again, and to pick up on some of Ian's points, ownership and control, for example, the negotiation of rights, now would be that moment. Ian, though, is right that I'm afraid what we're going to see. Ian's right on a number of scores. That goes without saying, of course. But first of all, I think that any recovery that we see is going to be incredibly patchy internationally. And speaking here from Europe, the issue we have of the balance between international and domestic traffic, of course, is very badly skewed. The Netherlands has very little domestic travel. Only Germany, Italy, the UK, France, Poland, a few of those countries have domestic travel, but almost all of the travel in Europe is between European states. And what we've seen at the moment in Europe, unfortunately, is the raising of barriers even within the European Union. And and President Macron last night was on the TV explaining that the lockdown continues. And I can't see the French allowing Spaniards in, for example, or more likely allowing Britons in. Well, just on good taste grounds alone, I guess, but not allowing Britons in for a very long time, given the disparate way and the different speed at which each of those countries is reacting to this. So I think the issue is really quite dire, and so the knee-jerk reaction that we've always seen is to prop up with state money and to privatise. But Brian's chart is really telling. Brian's chart is incredibly telling. There are 30 airlines in the world that are worth saving, is what Brian's chart one of Brian's charts tells us, or indeed two of Brian's charts tell us. And I ask you, Achim, does the world really need Alitalia? Is the world better with Alitalia in it? Does the world need Tarom? There are airlines around the world which Brian's chart says perhaps we ought to get rid of. And if we do that, perhaps we can move on to a much more sophisticated, frankly mature position where we have fewer but very much stronger airlines. And then, as Brian again very rightly said, there will be lower barriers to entry, because with fewer airlines and fewer flights, there'll be aircraft available, there'll be slots available, there'll be gates available and so on. So we might actually, if we do this right, get to a competitive outcome. It's good to dream. It's good to dream, as Shakespeare said, but as Aldous Huxley said, we should dream pragmatically, and I'm afraid that's probably not what's going to happen. While I have the floor just for a moment, I should also just mention another part of the aviation ecosystem, which is, of course, the air navigation service providers, the air traffic control agencies, who are facing a different set of issues again to both of the airlines and the airports. Mike very rightly pointed out some of the differences with airports. The problem with ANSPs, of course, is that lower traffic means fewer flights, means lower traffic, means lower revenue under their current business model, which is on a pay per blip basis. There'll be fewer blips, so there'll be less pay. But of course, and with the deepest of respect to airports and indeed airlines, you don't, generally speaking, need a PhD to work for an airline or an airport, but you almost certainly do to work in an ANSP. You've got to go through training that costs upwards of $250,000 euros, whatever unit you want to use, and getting rid of those staff is significantly more difficult. The move to renationalisation will see a move backwards, back to 1944 in terms of air traffic control, just at a time when the technology is finally bringing us up to 1990, and we could be going to space-based, satellite-based navigation, we could be going to satellite-based surveillance, and if we did that, we could get away with fewer ANSPs as well. But they too face a really difficult problem, and of course at the moment they're almost all, give or take, NATS and half of the Italian ANSP state-owned. And the first thing, one of the first things after slots we saw was an agreement certainly between European governments that they would waive air traffic control charges, which is fine, but it means the air navigation service providers have got no revenue at a time when they've got incredibly expensive staff. So I'll leave it there, Achim, but there are a few initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think something that comes to my mind when you're talking about nationalization is I think one of the issues that people talk when they talk about this pandemic is that this will sort of reduce globalization and this sort of nationalization, and then maybe also this sort of having a national airline may actually be more important. But that's something I think that's it may not be so straightforward, actually, the answer.
I agree with you entirely. It's a real risk. I mean, we seem to be moving backwards to 1944 in aviation terms, almost at the speed of light. And that's really scary. And as Ian said, I think we run the risk of undoing the hard-won gains that we've been fighting for since about 1975 and deregulation in the US. And that's heartbreaking at some levels, absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah. So we talked about airlines, we talked about airports, we talked about air traffic control, we talked about some regulatory perspective on capacity, bilateral capacity agreements. I think, Peter, you can also comment on you're an expert in not just in aviation, but also on tourism, the tourism sector. So maybe you could add some comments to this from the perspective of the tourism industry.
Yes. Oh, well, thank you very much, Achim. I think with tourism, it's very much the case that, at least from our perspective, what goes on with tourism also goes on with air transport. At least we're interested in at least the people that go by air transport. And so a number of things that people have said, like Ian and particularly Brian, I'd agree with, and I'd just try to go into some of these issues in a little bit more detail. So looking at the picture, there is one positive effect, namely that there is pent-up demand, and that is, of course, with passengers wanting to travel. They wanted to go and now they couldn't, and now they'd still like to go. So that's a good thing. And then from the airline's perspective, of course, there are a lot of trips that have been booked, but of course, the airlines have had to cancel them. And they've issued vouchers. And then, of course, the idea is that they will be redeemed. So that will mean that air transport goes up. But of course, it may not be very profitable from the point of view of the airlines, because they're actually just, killing off a debt. Okay. However, there are other effects that are going on. One thing about tourism is that and particularly its relationship with air transport, is that it follows the economic cycle. Incomes go up, tourism goes up, and air transport goes up with a multiplier. So that's good. And so normally you'd expect something of a bounce back in incomes being accompanied by a boom in air transport. Now, to some extent that will be the case, but there are some big qualifications in this situation. A number of people have mentioned some of these ones, and I'll just briefly mention them, but something that I'd just like to say about is the position of the traveller. The question is, do the travellers, or will the travellers, have the money to travel, at least for the short term? Of course, a lot of these people who would have been on a plane are now unemployed, or a lot of people are facing reduced incomes and so forth. And so they're using up their cash. And so tourism and air transport are discretionary expenditures. And so that might be a while before the travellers have enough money to go into the market again. I'm not saying that it's going to go forever, but it might mean that it's going to be a fairly slow response. The second thing that is present in this particular downturn is that people with jobs have been using up their leave, and therefore they don't have the time to go travelling. And so that's another thing which means that there's going to be a slow response, or at least slower than usual. Another thing that people haven't really been mentioning, which I think might be a factor, would be what you might call the fear factor. In other words, people may not be, even though they might be allowed to go, they might find that they're really worried about it all. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of people who would say, well, you know, I'm not so sure about going internationally, even though I might be allowed. And so I think that's going to be a factor which is a bit difficult to quantify, but nonetheless, it may be important for the time being. And then there is, of course, the thing that a number of people have mentioned, namely that a number of countries may not allow you to go overseas. And as Ian has mentioned, Australia, is, the Minister for Trade has said a couple of days ago that you know, it may not be possible for Australians to go overseas this year. That means, of course, that at least those airlines that have a big domestic market, they'll get at least a boost from that when domestic travel is allowed in. And that'll, of course, be the first to be allowed. And so those might be sort of countries like, you know, Canada, China, obviously already, and so on, US. But of course, the smaller countries, geographically smaller countries, that's a bit of a problem. Okay, so just to sort of sum up, the real thing that we haven't mentioned so far is what's going to happen in terms of vaccines and treatments. If there is a vaccine available fairly soon, or treatments and so on, then that's a good thing for aviation, because once that's the case and it's been shown to be reliable, then the worries that people have been having, and with governments particularly, may be evaporating fairly quickly. On the other hand, we just don't know when these vaccines and so forth will become available, or whether there will be some treatments even though there isn't a vaccine, and so forth. And so overall, I would certainly agree with what the thrust of what people were saying is that it's going to be a pretty slow move back to normal.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Peter. This is covering the whole tourism part, I think, very well. And Xiaowen, Brian already mentioned quite a few times the Chinese market. So we see some recovery there. Do you think are there some lessons for the other parts of the world on how to ramp up aviation after the sort of the number of cases sort of are slowing down?
Well, if you look at the Chinese aviation market, indeed, there are some good signs. If you look at the domestic market, as Brian mentioned, load factor is about like close to around 60%. But that comes with a capacity reduction. Now, if you look at aircraft utilization rate, I think it has declined from about 9 hours a day, more than 9 hours a day, to now about 3 hours. With the narrow body aircraft slightly higher, with the wide body mainly used for international travel is even lower, because international capacity is probably about 10% of the crisis level, whereas the domestic market is right now, depending on the numbers, I think the latest is close to 50%. And because there's going to be a May holiday, and also the Chinese government is really want to boost the economy, I think we are likely going to see a further growth of the domestic market. So if you look at the speed of domestic market coming back, it's quite significant. I would say it's pretty sharp, because I think it's unlike previous crisis. This time, much of the drop is due to for example, the supply side, that is, for example, the government lockdown, then there are still some demand for traveling, for business and leisure, right? If it's safe. But because of the safety concern, because of the lockdown, so that demand has been constrained. So once you remove the constraint, you're going to see a sharp comeback of the demand. But that demand, as it goes up, then the demand factor will eventually comes in. First, there are still some of the concern of the safety of traveling. Some people are still concerned, right? And secondly is the overall economy, the recession. A similar example is, for example, in mainland China, there has been the government trying to push the resumption of work. So the companies work very hard to get their workers come to the factory, but then they noticed the orders are gone. So the problem is, yes, as it has become safe to travel, I would say relatively safe to travel, now then the people saying is the income and also jobs, unemployment rates are increasing and orders are going and the economy is going down. So in that case, people will start to worry about the income, and they're going to be more cautious, even though there's a good deals, for example, for travel and other things. So I think I would say probably the lesson is it's going to be a sharp rebound, but it's not going to be a full rebound because of the demand factor, economic concern will come in. Well, the question is whether we can learn from the Chinese experience. Well, I think it's, for example, the Chinese government actually has been providing some of the support, obviously, to the aviation industry. In early March, there has been, for example, the reduction in airport fees and also the charge. So that's going to remove some of the financial burden. Then also in March, there has been an introduction of the subsidy to airlines. Now, that subsidy is for example, for some of the international route, for route which are flight by multiple airlines. Then one airline can get the subsidy about 1.76 cent, I think Chinese cent, which is, well, 7 Chinese yuan equal to $1. So that's like 1.76 Chinese yuan cent per ASK if this route is served by multiple airlines. Now, if there's only one airline serving on this route, then the subsidy, I think it's 5.2 something cent, which is less than US dollar 1 cent. That's not that much, I would say, in terms of the percentage of the cost. But this is, I think it's according to the policy, this is open to both Chinese airline and foreign airlines. And I think the way is that if you provide support to airlines, the problem is the government should not pick the winners, right? But in this way, you subsidize on the output. I would say this would be more neutral. But this policy was designed, I think, was announced in in March, backdated to end of January. So at that time, people are still not that clear about how serious the impact to the aviation industry. I think that's not enough. I expect sooner or later there are going to be more financial support. Financial support will come in. Now let's come to the issue is the fairness, right? We talk about, for example, some of the airline people argue they probably should not be there. But the problem is, if you look at what happened during this crisis, for example, when people really need aviation capacity for deliver medical equipment, then for politicians, they would feel, I really want my own airlines when I really need it. I think it's the nationalism also come back as I think politicians will think, look, when in the time of emergency, I want to count on my own airline. So I would expect there will be some argument and actions to support some of the so similar to the flag carriers of countries support. And after that, then that's going to bring more change to the aviation industry, like each government trying to subsidize their own airlines. What's the issue of competition? And on the one hand, we're going to see some of the airline going to be consolidated. So, so these are the policy side. Lastly, let me summarize whether this other market going to see similar comeback of the domestic market. Now, I think one candidate, for example, is United States, which have a larger domestic market, with also within one under one authority. Now, the problem is, if you look at the Chinese market, is much of the infections and also epidemic center is in one city, is in Wuhan or in one provinces. So that's it's much, I would say, because the city lockdown. So many of the cases were concentrated on one market. The rest of the country are not that severely damaged. So or have so many cases, didn't have that many cases. Now, which means it give some of the facility, I would say, the justification for reboosting the countrywide market. Whereas in United States, I think that there are few other than New York, and there's also a few hotspots. So I think whether it's going to have a national comeback or maybe a more phased-in market reboosting, it depends on how the situation of the epidemic is controlled. Another case is if you look at Europe. Europe is more complex because the different states will have different concern and also level of the virus control. I think it's more likely to be phased-in, probably some point or between selected state that's going to move first. That may not have a very synchronized like a reboosting. That's going to be a slightly different story.
Yeah. So I think you're raising a lot of good points, in particular also something that we're going to discuss in the next session. And this is kind of nationalization. Will we have more? How is this going to affect the dynamics of liberalization of aviation markets? Will it help liberalization or will it work against liberalization? And I think that's something that we're going to discuss after the break. I think right now we heard all these points made from the panelists and not much interaction. But now in the second part, we have all the interaction, right? So then you can sort of, I will ask all the panelists to respond to each other and to start sort of the discussion after all these points have been raised. So I would say we plan to have 10 minutes of a break, but maybe we have only 5. Okay, so we start as planned at 11 a.m. Central European summertime. Okay, so let's meet in 5 minutes again and continue the discussion or start the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Achim? Achim?
Yes. Who's speaking? Hello? I think it's Nicole.
It was Nicole Adler.
It sounded like Nicole.
Yeah, it was Nicole.
All right, it was a short break, but I think now actually we have like more than 160 people attending the current session. I think this is amazing because we just announced it a few, like 2 weeks ago or so, and so many people are attending. So this is really fascinating and great, and something that shows how powerful these softwares and the new technologies are actually. So I was wondering whether Nicole Adler from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Nicole, do you have any? Did we miss something in the first session that you would like to sort of think we should also cover in the discussion?
So Achim, I'm very sorry, but it's actually more connected to the software. What would be really helpful is if it's possible, to allow everyone to chat. At the moment, only the presenters are able to chat, and I think you might be able to gather some interesting questions if it's possible to allow everyone to participate.
Yes. Sorry. No, that's a very good point, actually. And I was a little bit wondering, why doesn't anyone join, ask any question in the chat? And I was just talking to our staff from the general office, and they said that everyone should be able to participate in the chat, which means that actually, maybe there's something we can do, but I don't know. Otherwise, so everyone
you need to make us all a member. You need to make us all a member, and then we will be able to.
Okay, so I just got a message from Willy Kruse, and this was a test match, and then for him, that seemed to work actually. So I think maybe Nicole, if is there something that you would like to? I think this technical issue, I think we do this in the background. Jagoda is also able to participate in the chat. So it seems to be working. Yeah. Now, so thank you very much, Nicole. Now it seems that everyone can participate in the chat. So what do you think? Is there something that we're missing so far in the discussion that you would like to be covered?
Achim, I'm assuming that you're going to go on to this, but I think the major question that's very clear from here is how we advise the governments to handle the issue of the airlines, whether we should encourage governments to provide a loan system that perhaps is less problematic in the ANSP world because they are mostly government organizations and have relatively lower risk. In the airport industry, with at least the big ones having lower risk, the airlines clearly are not in that category. We see piecemeal approaches to the story across the world. We saw the Norwegians providing 500 million in loans to 3 airlines, 50% going to Norwegian, which is one of the low-cost carriers that was in trouble before COVID, and 25% to SAS, and to Widerøe, which is the airline serving the north and mostly the PSO routes. We see that the Americans have come up with 60 billion to the airlines, provided they employ all of their staff until the 30th of September. We see the British saying, don't come to us, go to your equity partners. I know my government is in a quandary as to whether or not to save El Al. I would love to hear the presenter's opinion on this issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think we start the discussion now among the panelists, and I think one issue I feel that is coming out of this, and also Nicole highlighted again, is kind of where are we moving from here, to a more liberal aviation market, or maybe to a more regulated and more constrained aviation market with perhaps less competition or more distorted competition in the future. Please, whoever wants to speak up first from the panelists, maybe you just go ahead. Another question that I had was to Mike was, people mentioned, so the airports seem in a better position, maybe air navigation service seems in a better position. Xiaowen mentioned that the airport fees have been waived. We also see that the air navigation services fees have been waived. Is there some ways that in the air navigation service help airlines in the current situation? That's another issue that sort of I thought would be interesting to discuss.
Well, Achim, let me go first. Waiving air navigation fees helps the airlines, but it doesn't help the air navigation service providers, does it? All it does is shift the problem somewhere else, and that's not necessary. That's not a solution. It's just it is literally a band-aid on what's going on. And it's easier, of course, to waive air navigation service charges because most, as a general comment, ANSPs are state-owned. As we move into private airports or to a larger number of private airports, that's much harder. And of course, the reality is that the only airports that are privatised are the profitable airports. And there's, as Mike said, there are a whole bunch of airports with tiny, smaller airports, not even tiny ones, less than 1 million passengers, say, who are currently receiving no traffic at all. And so they're in a different place again. It's very hard to see how we're not going to go back to a more nationalised industry, and I'm talking here the entire ecosystem, a more nationalised industry. As Louise said, the issue only is which path we take to that. Is it a loan? Is it equity? Is it a subsidy? Is it a gift? Whatever happens, I think. But the trouble with that is what all of these steps, everything we've done, even trying to save Norwegian, there is the definition of good money after bad. All we're trying to do here is get back to the status quo ante. And perhaps the correct question to ask is why? Why are we doing that? Why don't we try to get to a new, better aviation industry? The aviation industry continues to genuinely believe it's 1944. And we regulate it like it's 1944. We control aeroplanes on the ANSP system like it's 1944. It's maybe the real question now to ask of our legislators, of our governments is, really? Do we really want to go back to having the airlines as they were in 1972? I just don't think that's a good outcome. And I think if we do that, we run the risk of committing one of the great sins, which is to let a crisis go to waste. And I think we should profit on this. We should capitalise on this while we can.
Actually, that's something that we can see just here in the chat from Wim Post on Eurocontrol, saying that this crisis could be an opportunity to make some big steps forward.
Hallelujah! I agree entirely. I haven't seen that chat, but hallelujah! I mean, I think we will be damned forever if we don't take advantage of this.
So how can we make sure that we can take advantage of this and do not make too many steps backwards? I think
the first thing to do is to pick up on Brian's slide and say, what is the right number of airlines in the world? And is it a one-for-one match with the number of countries in the world? I don't think so. As Ian said, now more than ever, we need to look at the ownership and control restrictions. Ownership and control restrictions, incidentally, that aren't even in the Chicago Convention. They were developed after the Chicago Convention at the time of the Bermuda I Agreement. So we need to readdress that. We need to readdress the whole issue of whether every country needs to provide its own air traffic control. We need to address a whole bunch of those sorts of issues at a straight up and down structural regulatory level, and we also need to try to embrace the hope that we might end up with good airlines, because I think the reality is that part of the thing we have to accept here is that the industry needs profitable airlines, not just lots of airlines. And we need to stop propping up all the bad ones, and we need to start just having good ones. And if we've got good airlines that are charging reasonable rates to provide a good service, then we're in a better place.
Well, I feel actually that Brian may be regretting right now having brought up this slides, because I don't think necessarily he was sort of proposing getting rid of the small ones, but rather how can we, highlighting that there are so many, airlines in trouble and that they need help.
He wasn't trying to get rid of them, because every single one, I don't know the exact number, but IATA's got about 250 members. So what Brian's slide basically said is it should have 30 members, or we should lose 220 airlines. And of course, that will be awful for Brian, because there goes a whole bunch of subscription fees right there. So, Brian, I mean, please don't, I like Brian enormously, and I admire and respect Brian, but please understand that IATA is not a government. IATA is a lobbying organisation. It's there to lobby for its members, and by definition, its members are the status quo. They are the status quo. They are the existing airlines. So we need to think outside the box of status quo. We need to think outside the box of business as usual and start to try to look at how we reshape it. Brian will still have members. Those members will be involved, but they'll actually be really good members then, and that would be terrific. It'll just be a smaller organisation, that's all.
So, Xiaowen,
I would say it's really not the issue that, for example, how we decide how many airlines should survive, how many airlines would go away. It's really designed. Now we want support to the aviation industry, but we want the support to be competition neutral. So the support, the real issue is, I think, whether some airline will die or not, whether they should have survived there. It's not the direct link to the COVID-19 issue. Now the issue here is a impact. Now how do we make this help available, but not really affecting the competition, not really changing the industry ecosystem backward? I think that's a real issue. So really, the real issue is how do we choose or design support in a way that help the country, help the industry to move forward. I think it's yes, there is a risk, as I mentioned, of a nationalism for various reasons. For example, at a time of emergency, sometimes you trust your own airline, etc. But now, if you look at Europe, the national support and national subsidy or state ownership issue has gone through a very painful process in the until 1990s. A few airlines, this national ownership issue has been there, but eventually, I think that there has been some more or less the consensus say, okay, we should let market to play. So I think that logic or arguments are still there. So people, I would say, of course, there are always people who want to insert their own agenda or to do the lobby where there's an opportunity. But I think that the industry, the academic, are aware of this argument. So I would say maybe some setback, but not dramatic.
I think here I think the issue is like that you're going to highlight is the competition neutrality. How can we have something that sort of doesn't interfere with the competitive process? So I have a lot of Mike wants to say something afterwards. Ian.
Sure. I have a bit more faith actually in the market. Certainly, there's going to be a challenge of financing the large national carriers for the short term. And there's going to be consolidation in the form of some mergers and failures. Flybe, there's a number of examples. But the aircraft are still going to be there. And the market seems to find ways to refinance those aircraft with new owners. And so it may be that we'll have markets that for a few years may consolidate down to the national carrier, or in the case of the bigger economies, the big three or whatever. But I really think that the market is going to find ways to redeploy those aircraft. It may be at much lower prices for the purchase and lease of aircraft. The market's going to adjust the price to demand, but unless nations reform their national ownership laws or negotiate a whole series of restrictive treaties, and I think nations will have other priorities for a couple of years, I think the market's going to surprise us in how they redeploy those aircraft.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really a very important issue. That the aircraft is just there, right? It's the airlines is very flexible, but the aircraft is an asset that is around for my number would be like 25 years or something like that. So it's just there, and someone will be using it. Ian, what would you like to add?
Yeah, so okay, actually a couple of things I'll pick up on the comment you just made first. And those assets are there, but their value is likely to drop, particularly for mid-sized wide bodies that are 10 years old. And we haven't talked yet about the banks and the leasing companies and what kind of risk they might be wearing. I mean, airports have got very long-term infrastructure that you can use over time. There are only so many end-of-life 747s you can turn into boutique hotels somewhere. So I think another part of this discussion at some point is what happens to the financial side of this industry, the leasing companies and the banks who have got multiple billions of dollars, not just in the air, but on order books that are supposed to be flowing in. I've seen numbers already that maybe 2,700 aircraft too many. And 2,000 of those are aircraft on order books at the moment. The other I was going to make was just with government support, I think it's useful to ring fence public service obligation routes. In big countries like ours or Canada or the north of Scandinavia, there are some places that are completely dependent on aviation. In an Australian context, medical services, education, a whole range of things from remote communities. And some of those, I think, need to be dealt with separately during this. We don't want to see small regional carriers disappear who are providing the only service in remote places. So perhaps in the discussion of what governments might do, I think there is a role for maintaining critical links and critical infrastructure apart from how we deal with the larger problem of major carriers. That's all I wanted to drop in.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm actually glad that you brought up the issue of aircraft financing, and abracadabra, I have a aircraft financing expert sitting here next to me, and his name is Dewey Yi. He's a visiting lecturer at PolyU, and he has like 30 years of experience in aircraft finance. So I was hoping that he could comment on how is the aircraft financing industry affected by the current crisis.
Well, I actually promised Achim that I wouldn't say anything. I just sit in the background because it's great to learn from the experts. I did just want to say that effectively, I think the issue that we're facing right now all comes down to dollars and cents. And the way that the governments and everyone else are trying to solve this issue is actually helping it refund itself and create more liquidity in the market. With respect to aircraft, maybe most people are aware or maybe not aware that half of the world's aircraft are actually owned by leasing companies. Therefore, the leasing business is taking half of the brunt right now. And the reason is because airlines don't have money to pay. And if airlines don't have money to pay, the leasing company is not getting any rental. And then if they don't have the rental, they can't actually pay the investors and the banks. So I think I'd like to just put that out there for now, because this would probably require a whole nother session for discussion, the leasing and financing and banking. So yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So this sort of shows us that there is also quite a challenge to the aviation aircraft leasing industry, and they also have to find their answers to this. Actually, I had some question or some comment from Barry Humphrey. So maybe you want to just speak up and unmute your mic and maybe switch on your video and then just comment.
Well, thank you. I was just attracted.
We can't hear you very well, actually. Maybe you have to. You still. Oh yeah. I think you still have your mic muted. Now it seems good. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, sort of. Yeah.
I was just attracted to the comment by Dan Elliott about the environment, and it seems to me that there's a lesson to be learnt from the financial crisis. If you think back, before the financial crisis, 2008 and 2009, the environmental issues were really prominent and aviation was under pressure. Along came the crisis, and guess what? Everybody forgot about the environment and they were only interested in jobs and the economy. And I suspect we're going to see the same again this time, that it will be economic issues, not environmental issues, that will dominate the discussion. So my guess is environment on the back burner for a while.
Yeah. So everyone, everyone agrees that sort of this is this going to help making the aviation industry in the longer term more environmental friendly, or not? What do you think?
Achim, can I jump in on that one?
Yes, please.
I think there are a couple of issues here. Barry's right that everyone's going to focus on jobs, but I also think what Peter said earlier is the reality is there'll be fewer flights, there'll be fewer passengers for the short to medium term. And notwithstanding Mike's love of the market, which I share, what I think we might see happening, what we've already seen happening, is a bunch of the really environmentally less friendly aircraft are now starting to be retired. We will never see another 747 in the air again unless it's at some historic fly past or something like that. We'll never see another A340 in the air again. We're going to start watching all of the older aeroplanes get retired. So even though Mike's love of the market is, of course, well placed, I think there will be fewer aircraft. And so some of the market forces will be working across a smaller base of aeroplanes. I also don't think that the environmental agencies or the environmental lobby groups have put themselves to sleep during this. I think they are looking at the situation now and saying, look how clean the air is, look how quiet it is, look how much better it is. And I think that there's a certain amount of work going into that as well on the environmental side. I note Bill Hemmings is on this chat. He might have a view on this as well, of course.
Yeah, this is sort of maybe, if I understand correctly, it's sort of good news because this may lead to some, utilization of newer and more modern aircraft and greener aircraft. There is one interesting question here, and I think that's something that in preparation of the panel discussion, we were thinking about, okay, how about ownership restrictions? And there is here a question from Noel. And the question is, what role might ICAO be expected to play in this debate, in particular with respect to state interventions affecting ownership and control? And I know that a lot of the panelists will have some opinion on this. Mike, maybe. How about you? Ownership control issues. Will this lead to sort of more liberal, should we have more liberal ownership control so that, countries that foreigners can own, other countries' airlines and so on and so forth?
Well, perhaps we should. I'm not sure there's going to be an appetite in government to do this. Like I indicated earlier, I think that there's going to be far higher priorities for legislatures and kings and queens to deal with than airline foreign ownership rules. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on
there is some, we can't hear you right now, Mike. Oh, there is some. Anyone else? Can you all hear me, or?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay.
Mike is from the frozen north of Canada, and he's clearly frozen.
Yeah, he's. So anyone else on ownership controls?
I'm sorry to speak again, but I think there's two things to note here. First of all, as I said earlier, it's got nothing to do with ICAO. It has nothing to do with ICAO. What does ICAO stand for? Impossible to conceive of any outcome. But if to pick up Mike's point, but go in a different direction, I think states have got much more to worry about than this. But I think one of the things they've got to do is to try to keep their aviation industry moving. So I think for a lot of states, an antediluvian restriction like ownership and control will simply be ignored. And since it is at a state level, not at an ICAO intergovernmental level, that those decisions are going to be made, I think there is a chance that it will happen. But please stop worshipping ICAO. It's got nothing to do with ICAO.
I see. Some other comments on ownership issues?
probably just one quick point about the environment issue, and then move on to the ownership issue you mentioned. I think for myself, I'm not 100% sure that all the old aircraft will go away, because look at the airlines. They're doing the economics calculation with much lower demand for old aircraft. This price basically depreciated the aircraft will be very low, and fuel price will be very low. So if you look at the total operational cost of this old, not very fuel efficient aircraft, their total operational cost may be low. And then airline desperate to save, they will not necessarily will just remove those aircraft. And also there were going to be some conversion to, for example, for air cargo. So I think it's a decision, and also this environment impact will depend on also fuel price and also the market condition. That's number one. Number two, it's about ownership. I think it's again, it's some countries, for example, they really need this aviation to support. For example, if you look at New Zealand, right, or Australia, they really need the aviation industry to competitive and efficient aviation industry. In that case, if the government face some of the pressure, constraint, they cannot really save or some of their airlines. I think the practical way is to allow foreign control, foreign ownership. Actually, if you look at Virgin Australia, they had some financial problems earlier, and that's why they have a foreign ownership. And actually, this happens in a market. Of course, it's fully liberalized. So I think it's whether the ownership will be there, or ownership control will still be very tight, and also depend on the resource availability. Lastly, I think that we briefly mentioned about liberalization, whether this is going to stop the liberalization and the deregulation process. I want to remind everybody that the aviation industry and the countries adopted deregulation, adopted privatization, adopted the liberalization, not because academic told them this is good or morally it is the right thing to do. This is for their own country's interest. And if the same rationale hold, even though there may be more a little bit concern about protecting or support their own airlines, I think the liberalization or the overall trend will still continue because it's helped each country's overall economy. Right, so there may be temporarily the lobbyist or this interest group will be more powerful, trying to persuade different governments to help your own employee, your own people. But overall, I think the rationale is there. It's liberalization. It's the help the overall economy and help the overall aviation industry. So I don't see a fundamental shift of liberalization. On the other hand, what worries me is, I think that Mike briefly mentioned, there may be actual regulations on, for example, this travel and the health control. It depends on what kind of control is introduced. Now, for example, there are now some of the reporting that you can do the virus check very reliably within 30 minutes. Now, if that can be done at a relatively low cost, let's say $10, $2, $20 US, within 30 minutes, if that's available, I think passengers, especially for international flight, they would be willing to pay that to get the peace of mind because 30 minutes, during the checking and waiting, that can be safely done. So I would say it depends on what kind of regulation and how much hassle and at what cost were going to be imposed. It's a question mark.
Actually, there was an interesting comment in the chat box on we have the low aircraft cost, and then we also have the low oil prices, right? And we have sort of that's something that we haven't really touched. Brian covered it. But the low oil prices, so this makes operation of the aircraft cheaper, and then this may lead to many new entrants, and then this could sort of improve the competitive situation in the aviation industry. Is this something that you would agree is going to happen?
That's what happened with new airline entrants coming. That would be at least in the medium to long term, because right now, if I'm an investor, jumping into the aviation industry right now, if you look at the the favorable aircraft price, fuel price, this is a risky situation. I think in the short term, airline will try some innovative ways in trying to really secure for the healthy airline. It's a time to consolidate the market, to really enhance the customer loyalty. It's like a frequent flyer programs, and also try to secure your operation. That's the short term. It will be good to survive. In the midterm, I think that's going to be a good time. That's because of the reduced number of airline and because of the recovery of the economy. That's the time that airline will be enjoying more pricing power and their profitability will increase. That's going to be probably the midterm. And so, the entrant will going to be the long term. When the profitability of the airline, when the economy is picking up, that's going to attract more new entrant coming.
Okay, so we have more and more comments coming in the chat box. So I would like to switch to the general discussion, but before we do this, maybe everyone, all the panelists can have like a final remark on whether they think the pandemic will have a positive effect on the future of aviation or a negative effect. Of course, the short-term effect is terrible, but let's say in 5 years from now, we think there have been some more positive effect or negative effects. What do you think? How will it affect the future of aviation? And then just a very brief sort of final statement, because then we move on to the Q&A session. Mike, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I find that crises like this lead to a more mature industry. I see a lot of benefits of a much more carbon efficient industry, a traveling public that are going to think about some issues in more serious ways. At the same time, I absolutely believe that the demand is going to come back. We're detecting enormous visiting friends and relative demand that will explode as soon as the markets open up. We have done some studying of what happened from the 1917 to 1919 flu pandemic and how it launched the Roaring '20s. I see that crises do lead to stronger, more effective things, and I recognize the A340s. Both of them are being retired, and the remaining 10 747s. But there's a lot of aircraft in the queue right now, even with order cancellations. There's a lot of capacity coming out with the 777X, the A350 order stream, the A320s that are being produced in China. I'll just stop here in the interest of time.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mike. How about who comes next? Maybe Ian?
Yeah, I think I'd echo Mike's comments that there will be a rebound. The question is more about when it happens than if it happens. And I think the challenge is going to be how we take it up, how we deal with the reintroduction of the industry, whether it happens country by country, bilaterally, whether one of the things I imagine is that some point-to-point flying will disappear because the market shrinks a bit. So maybe the hub airports will strengthen in the short term. But just looking back over the time at even Boeing's order books over time, we've had a dip every time the market has recovered and come back. And you go back, it's grown from 100 million to 1 billion to 4 billion over time. There'll be a hiccup now, but maybe we should get together in 3 years' time and reflect on this discussion today and see what's happened.
Yeah. How about Peter? What do you think?
Good. Hello. Yeah, I think one thing that will be important is that there'll be basically the industry will be changed, and I think we've mentioned a number of different ways in which it will be. One issue might be the competitive issue, and say Andrew was saying, well, he could see 30 airlines surviving and so on. Now, of course, that will depend, of course, on what governments are doing, and of course, quite a number of governments may be supporting their airlines partly because of jobs, partly because of having a national champion and so on. And a few may be interested in promoting competition or making sure that competition exists, which is actually the case, I think, in Australia. And so what the airline industry will and the aviation industry will consist of, I think, will be changing. Another aspect which we haven't mentioned much is the question of nationalisation. And so a number of countries may be having governments taking a stake in airlines, as did happen in the crisis in 2008-9 and so on, a bit of that, but it might be a lot more of that this time round. Whether that will make a big difference, that will resolve the question of whether the airline will exist or not, and it might mean for more competition in a sense, but there'll be problems down the way as a result of that. So it's a question of what will the industry look like? And I think those are some of the important questions. For example, just to finish off, the way in which governments are throwing money around, I won't say away, that will affect what happens. So that if there is, if there are loans or very conditional subsidies and so on, make quite a big difference in terms of what will actually happen. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Peter. Xiaowen, how about you? So the aviation industry at the end, will it benefit or will it be, will it help progress to a better aviation industry in the future, the current crisis?
Well, I think there will be change, but probably not as dramatic as we expect. I think for example, there will be fewer airlines, and we already mentioned consolidation. But when these come back with pick up, there may still be some of the new airline established. And that's going to probably not as many, because if you look at the profit margin of the aviation industry over the past 2 decades, 3 decades has been quite low. I think the investors will become more mature. They will be, they know what's going to be the likely outcome. So there may be some entrant, but probably not as many. So that's going to bring back the profitability of the aviation industry into a more healthy level. Now, if you look at, for example, the nationalization, I think it's really the government. I doubt that many governments really want to own and manage their airlines. They have viewed the history. So I think it's really the investment taking the stake is as if, okay, now this the house is on fire, so let's do something to control. So it's like an emergency act to really, most of the case, I would say it's like an emergency rescue to help those airlines. And once the industry is stabilized, once everything back to the normal, I think most the government they should realize it's makes sense to divest those interests to really ensure competition. Because right now, nobody care that much about competition issue. It's not like people don't realize this. It's the situation so urgent. It's on fire. We need to get the cash out to airline so that to reduce, for example, the layoffs. Now, if you look at some of the countries, they just give out money to everybody is really to try to stabilize, because this type of shock, this magnitude, is more or less like rarely happen. So I think it's the save the economy. That's precisely, for example, if the Chinese case is the government want to boost the economy and they want to help the tourism, hotel, logistics, right? And all those need the input from the aviation industry. So I think it's the government will be less concerned about competition issue, less concerned about national stake ownership issue, because right now this is at the middle of the crisis. We are on fire. But I think it's overall government will realize that you need to act rationally, and that's why, for example, if you look at the case I mentioned, even the subsidy, they are thinking, okay, if this route is served by multiple airlines, you get less. If it's only one airline, you get much more. And this is apparently an effort to maintain connectivity, or it's like, for example, it's like essential services or etc. I think it's the government officials, they are rational. I think at least in the long term, I think hopefully the ration will prevail rather than
yeah, good. So this is sort of the opinion that actually, most likely we are on a path, and this is not a major push, so to say, that will bring us in one or the other direction, hopefully. So Andrew, I left the last word for you. So what do you? I mean, not the last word of this whole session, but of the panel.
This is very brave of you, Achim. Well, I think I mean I don't disagree with my panel, with all of the other people on the panel. A couple of notes though. I really enjoy anyone who hopes for rational behaviour from governments, because that's really optimistic. I do love to see it. I do love to hear of optimists. I think ironically, the longer the recession or depression or whatever comes out of this lasts, if this is V-shaped, then it's business as usual. It's unlikely, I mean, I think we've already agreed it's unlikely to be V-shaped. The longer it's L-shaped, the more catastrophic the outcome for the current aviation industry, the more chance we've got of actually building a better, newer aviation industry. And I think we'll see, as Ian mentioned, as Xiaowen mentioned, we're going to see a lot of public service obligation routes. We're going to see subsidised routes to maintain connectivity, but I hope we end up with a more competitive, harder, better aviation industry at the end of it, which will include airports and ANSPs and everyone else as well.
Yeah, so I think this is a good message, so to say, that we're having a tough period right now, but actually the final outcome at the end can be quite good, because it can help make the aviation industry more fit, so to say, for the future. So what I would like to do now is I would just we will stop the recording now, which means that now anyone who wants to ask a question can unmute